Before we step back into history, if you enjoy uncovering the real stories behind the world's defining moments, please take a quick second to subscribe. It helps us keep these memories alive. The sound was not an explosion. Not at first. It was a scream. A mechanical, piercing shriek that dropped from the sky and tore into your skull. On the beach, thousands of men stopped breathing at the exact same moment. They knew that sound. It was the Jericho trumpet, the siren mounted on the Junkers Ju-87, the Stuka. There was nowhere to run. That was the reality of the beach. You could dig a hole in the sand, but sand does not stop shrapnel. You could run into the water, but the water was where the bullets hit. So you just curled up. You covered your head with your hands. You prayed to a God you hadn't spoken to in years. The bomb hit the sand 50 yards away. The ground didn't just shake. It liquefied. A wall of sand and fire rose 3 stories high. The concussion wave hit the men like a physical punch to the chest. Then came the silence. That terrible ringing silence before the screaming started. This was May 1940. Dunkirk, the northern coast of France. The German war machine had just done the impossible. They had bypassed the Maginot Line, punched through the Ardennes forest, and swept across France with terrifying speed. The British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army were cut off, pushed back, trapped. Behind them was the enemy. In front of them was the English Channel, 21 miles of cold gray water separating them from home. 400,000 men were squeezed into a shrinking perimeter. The German High Command was laughing. They called it a simple cleanup operation. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was preparing the British public for a colossal military disaster. He expected to save maybe 30,000 men. That was the math. That was the logic. But logic has no place in war. Arthur wiped the wet sand from his eyes. He was 20 years old. He looked like an old man. His uniform was stiff with salt and sweat. He hadn't slept in 3 days. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 5. He looked down the beach. It stretched for miles. It looked like an anthill kicked over. Black lines of men stretched from the dunes down to the water's edge. They stood in shoulder-deep water for hours, waiting for ships that couldn't get close enough. The air smelled of sulfur. It smelled of rotting seaweed and burning oil. The black smoke from the burning oil tanks in the harbor rolled over them like a funeral shroud, turning noon into twilight. Arthur looked at the man next to him, a corporal. His face was gray. He was staring at the horizon, shaking. Not from cold, from the sheer scale of the hopelessness. "They're not coming, are they?" the corporal whispered. Arthur didn't look at him. He fixed his eyes on the gray line where the sea met the sky. "They have to," Arthur said. "Just wait." "There's no ships left, Artie. The destroyers can't get in. The draft is too shallow." "Shut up," Arthur snapped. But his voice lacked heat. He knew the corporal was right. The big destroyers were sitting ducks. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. Every time a Royal Navy ship came close to the East Mole, the long concrete breakwater, the Stukas dived. Arthur reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled notebook. He had been writing in it since they landed in France. He shielded it from the wind with his body. He wrote, "The waiting is worse than the dying. At least the dead don't have to watch the sky. We are just standing here, waiting for the end of the world." Then the whistle blew. An officer, a tall man with a bandaged head, walked down the line. He wasn't yelling. He didn't have the energy to yell. "Form up," the officer said. "Columns of 3. Get to the mole." "Sir," Arthur asked, "is there a ship?" "Just move, soldier." They began the trudge. It wasn't a march. It was a shuffle. Thousands of boots dragging through heavy wet sand. They moved toward the east mole. This was a wooden and concrete jetty that extended nearly a mile out into the sea. It wasn't designed for loading ships. It was a breakwater. But it was the only thing they had. The wooden planks of the mole were slippery with oil and blood. It was narrow. If you slipped, you fell 15 feet into the churning water or onto the jagged rocks below. Arthur stepped onto the wood. The structure groaned under the weight of thousands of boots. Then the air raid sirens from the town began to wail again. "Eyes up!" someone shouted. 3 Messerschmitts roared over the harbor, banking hard. Their machine guns chewed up the water. Sparks flew off the concrete. "Down! Get down!" Arthur threw himself flat on the wooden planks. He felt the wood vibrating against his cheekbone. The bullets stitched a line of holes into the wood inches from his hand. Splinters dug into his skin. He heard the roar of the engines pass. He looked up. The man in front of him wasn't moving. Arthur scrambled to his knees. He grabbed the man's shoulder. "Get up," Arthur said. "Come on, mate. We're almost there." The man slid sideways. He fell silently off the edge of the mole and splashed into the dark water below. Arthur froze. "Keep moving," the officer screamed. "Don't stop. If you stop, you die." Arthur forced himself to stand. His legs felt like lead. He looked at the gap in the line where the man had been. "Why are you stopping?" the soldier behind him hissed. "He's gone," Arthur said. "Then move." They reached the end of the mole. There was a destroyer there, the HMS Grenade. It looked massive. It looked like salvation. Nets were draped over the side. Men were climbing up, desperate, clawing at the ropes. Arthur grabbed a rope. The hemp burned his palms. He hauled himself up, his boots slipping on the wet steel hull. He made it over the railing and collapsed onto the deck. He thought it was over. He thought he was safe. But the harbor was a trap. 10 minutes later, the screech returned. A Stuka formation dived directly at the ship. Arthur watched, paralyzed, as a bomb detached from the plane's belly. It looked like it was falling in slow motion. It went straight down the ship's funnel. The explosion tore the grenade apart from the inside. The deck buckled. Heat, intense and sudden, seared Arthur's eyebrows. He was thrown into the air. He hit the water hard. The cold was a shock that stopped his heart. He went under. Darkness, chaos, debris sinking around him. He kicked to the surface, gasping for air. The water was thick. It tasted like poison. It was covered in a layer of heavy fuel oil. Around him, men were screaming, thrashing in the black slime. The ship was sinking fast, dragging men down with the suction. Arthur grabbed a piece of floating timber. He wiped the oil from his eyes, but it just smeared. He was blind. He was freezing. He was drifting away from the mole. "Help!" a voice cried out near him. "I can't see." Arthur paddled toward the voice. He grabbed a collar. "I've got you," Arthur choked out. "Hold on to the wood." They floated there for an hour, maybe 2. Time stopped making sense. The sun began to set, turning the smoke-filled sky a bruised purple. Arthur's legs were numb. He couldn't feel his feet. Hypothermia was setting in. He knew what happened next. You just get tired. You just close your eyes for a second. And then You slip under. I can't hang on, the man beside him whispered. You hold on, Arthur said. His teeth were chattering so hard it hurt. You hold on, or I'll punch you. There's no one coming, Artie. Look. Arthur looked. The destroyer was gone. The mole was too far away. The sea was empty. He closed his eyes. He thought about his mother's kitchen in Birmingham. The smell of tea, the radio playing in the corner. Lord, he thought, just let it be quick. And then he heard it. Not a scream, not a roar, a chug, a low, rhythmic thrumming. Arthur opened his eyes. He thought he was hallucinating. Out of the smoke, a boat appeared. But it wasn't a destroyer. It wasn't a Navy ship. It was a white pleasure cruiser, the kind you saw on the Thames on a Sunday afternoon. It had varnished wood rails and a little flag fluttering in the wind. And behind it, another. A fishing trawler, rusty and smelling of cod. And behind that, a lifeboat, a fire tug, a barge. They came out of the mist like ghosts. Hundreds of them. The little ships. It was the most ridiculous, beautiful armada in the history of warfare. These weren't soldiers. These were weekend sailors, fishermen, bankers, mechanics. They had crossed the channel in boats made for rivers and lakes. They had come into a war zone with nothing but life jackets and courage. The white cruiser pulled up next to them. A man in a thick wool sweater leaned over the side. He looked like a grandfather. He was smoking a pipe. "Bit wet down there, lads?" the old man shouted. Arthur started to laugh. It was a hysterical, broken sound. "Grab the hook!" the old man yelled. Arthur grabbed the boat hook. He shoved the blinded man up first. Then, strong hands grabbed Arthur's tunic and hauled him over the rail. He landed on the deck. It was dry. It was solid. The old man handed him a blanket and a mug of hot tea. Where did you come from?" Arthur stammered. The old man pointed his pipe back toward England. "We heard you boys needed a lift," he said. "So we came." Arthur stood up, wrapped in the blanket. He looked out over the water. The sea was covered with them, tiny dots of hope bobbing in the swell. They were darting in where the big ships couldn't go, picking up men from the beaches, ferrying them to the destroyers, or taking them all the way home. Arthur opened his notebook one last time. The pages were soaked, the ink running. He wrote, "I saw a miracle today. It didn't look like angels. It looked like a fishing boat." By the time they reached Dover, the sun was coming up. The white cliffs looked like ivory in the morning light. Arthur expected to be arrested. He expected shame. They had retreated. They had lost France. They had left all their tanks and guns behind. They were a defeated army. But as the little boat chugged into the harbor, he heard a sound. Cheering. The docks were packed. Civilians. Women with sandwiches. Men with cigarettes. They were cheering. They weren't cheering for a victory. They were cheering for life. They were cheering because their sons were home. Arthur stepped onto the British soil. He fell to his knees. He wasn't praying. He was just feeling the earth. In the span of 9 days, Operation Dynamo defied every expectation. The official Admiralty forecast was to save 45,000 men. They saved 338,226. Over 800 civilian boats joined the Navy destroyers. They sailed into the mouth of hell. Many didn't come back. They were blown out of the water by mines, smashed by bombs, or simply swallowed by the sea. But they emptied the beach. The evacuation of Dunkirk was not a victory in the traditional sense. Wars are not won by evacuations, but it was a victory of the human spirit. It preserved the British Army. It allowed Britain to fight on. Without Dunkirk, there is no D-Day. Without Dunkirk, the history of the world looks very different today. If you want more forgotten stories of real people who lived through the Second World War, subscribe. This channel exists to bring their voices back. War creates heroes, but it also creates shadows, and on those 9 days in May, the shadows stretched across the channel, and the heroes came in rowing boats to bring them home.